Thank you, Keith, very much, and thank you to the Black Diamond Historical Society for welcoming us all to their beautiful museum. Such a wonderful place, a real regional treasure. I'm Kurt Armbruster, and I got interested in trains and railroading at an early age, and having that interest, I like to sit with maps, trace out the railroad lines of Seattle area, King County, and Washington, discover where they went. I became familiar with the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Milwaukee, all the big railroads of the day. Then one day I happened to discover this little short line. It said Pacific Coast. What is that? Well, other folks made the same discovery in their own way. You might be motoring down the main street in Renton in the 1940s and find yourself face to face with this apparition from the past. Antique steam engine and line of battered freight cars, and think, where did that come from? Where's that going? What's it doing here? This was the Pacific Coast Railroad. Distinctly unimpressive operation, no more than 40-odd miles at its maximum extent. Small, grimy, grungy, no passenger expresses, no hotshot freights. Nevertheless, the Pacific Coast and its predecessors, the Seattle and Walla Walla, the Columbia and Puget Sound, were extremely important for the development of Seattle and all King County. My book's entitled Pacific Coast, Seattle's Own Railroad, but it's really King County's railroad, our railroad. The development of the railroad led to ripples which spread throughout the whole region. Well, Seattle was born in 1851 when white settlers, the Denneys, the Maynards, the Yeslers, the Terrys, uprooted themselves from their previous lives and made the arduous wagon journey to the far northwest, determined to build a city. At the core of this determination lay the belief that they would soon be connected to the rest of the country by a railroad. Without a railroad, what was the point? They'd be stuck way out here at the edge of the earth. Said Arthur Denny, I came to the coast with the belief that a railroad would be built across the continent to some point on the northern coast within the next 15 or 20 years, and located on the Sound with that expectation. The hopes of Denny and his neighbors appeared vindicated only 2 years after Seattle's birth, when a congressionally funded surveying party led by Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens explored the northern United States, looking for a railroad route to the west. This is one of several surveying parties in the field at the time, all scouting out potential routes. But Stevens was a very good salesman, and he proclaimed that the northern route was best, and that Seattle, as the western terminal, combines the greatest number of advantages. Well, this Northern Railroad would be a long time coming, and Seattle's first 2 decades were tough times. Settlers were steadily heading for the Pacific Northwest, but conflict with the Native American inhabitants, frequent economic slumps, and of course the turmoil of the Civil War all hindered development. However, Seattle was lucky. She had one thing everybody wanted: coal. In the 19th century, coal was king. Coal heated homes, powered factories and steamships. Coal was black gold. But it don't come easy, as I'm sure you know. Coal is way down there, and it has to be dug out, and it has to be hauled to market. Extremely arduous processes. They demanded a lot of backbone and a lot of money. Nevertheless, small-scale coal mining began in the foothills east of Lake Washington in the 1860s, within 10 years of Seattle's founding. And in February of 1870, Seattle businessmen formed the Seattle Coal Company and the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company to expand operations. From the first mine at Newcastle, just east of Lake Washington, horses trundled coal cars along a 3-mile tramway to the east shore of Lake Washington. And then it was barged 7.5 miles up to the east side of Seattle, which was all wilderness then, to Union Bay, transferred to coal cars again to cross Montlake, what we now call Montlake Cut, down Portage Bay and Lake Union by barge again, and then again transferred to more coal cars to go down to the bluff at the foot of Pike Street, and then it was dumped into a bunker at the bottom of the bluff, and then it had to be skiffed out to waiting sailing ships. A very, very labor-intensive, cumbersome process. But it got things going. Things took a big leap forward in late 1871 when a sailing ship delivered the first steam locomotive to run on Puget Sound, little 7-ton machine, soon nicknamed Ant. Small even for its day, but it did a big job. March 25th, 1872, the Ant was the star of city celebrations of the first train rides in Seattle. Seattle Coal and Transportation Company was steadily upgraded. One of the prime features was this remarkable 250-foot elevation, 900-foot-long incline on the east shore of Lake Washington. This is a very rare image, one of 2, taken of this incline in the fall of 1874. Worked by gravity, coal cars coming from the top, Newcastle, up here 3 miles. They were hooked to a cable which was attached to a brake drum. Man standing up here worked the brakes. How would you like to do that? The loaded coal cars slowly descended, acting as counterweights to empty cars going up. And they met in the middle here at a passing track. This is a steam donkey engine with another cable attached probably to winch barges in to the slip just behind the photographer, or perhaps to move coal cars off the barges onto the rails. The system worked surprisingly well. There were 1 or 2 runaways, but no one was killed that I've ever discovered. Well, nonetheless, it was still a fairly cumbersome operation altogether. But they were getting there. In Seattle, they built this coal bunker at the foot of Pike Street. Here you see the incline again, another incline, gravity operated. Coal cars would be winched down by cable and moved out the pier. We don't know how they moved them out, probably by another steam donkey to the bunker here. Here's the side wheel steamer Dakota loading coal as fuel. On the other side is a sailing ship, one of several that was in steady service between Seattle and San Francisco, probably taking on another load of coal. San Francisco was the primary market for Newcastle coal. Well, all this was a great stimulant to industry. Newcomers flooded in, houses built, new industry sprouted. Seattle and King County were beginning to boom. Well, all this was great, but it still wasn't a transcontinental railroad. In 1870, things looked up when the first spike in the Northern Pacific Railroad was driven in Minnesota, destination Puget Sound. This prompted a new wave of migration to Washington Territory and ignited fresh hope in Seattle. But in July 1873, the Northern Pacific announced that it would terminate not in Seattle, but in Tacoma. Seattle's railroad dream was shattered. Outraged Seattleites gathered in town meetings, gnashing their teeth. What is to be done? Thankfully, one fellow knew the answer. Sir Lucius Garfield, sometime politician, financier of shady background, but he was a great talker, and he was one of early Seattle's most important figures. For he said, "Hey, Seattle, don't cry over spilt milk. Roll up your sleeves. Build your own railroad. Build a railroad to Walla Walla." That was the biggest town in Washington Territory at the time. Wheat center, very important community. There it could link up with a line coming from the east. Seattle's future would be assured. Well, how far is Walla Walla from here? Yeah, easily said, not so easily done. Well, said Garfield, he had an answer for that. All the folks along the prospective route of this railroad should donate land. That would solve a lot of problems. And everybody else should buy construction bonds to pay for building this railroad. Seattle must put up its money and roll up its sleeves. If she did, the world would take notice. So they did. Just days after the announcement that the Northern Pacific would terminate in Tacoma, Seattle businessmen formed the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad and Transportation Company. They pledged money to buy bonds, and on May 1st, 1874, the whole population of Seattle turned out to start building. After one day, they had graded out a respectable 1 mile of roadbed. By fall, several miles had been cleared. Well, folks quickly discovered railroad building was not a job for amateurs. For a small town like Seattle, there just wasn't enough cash money or enough skilled labor to do the job. Thankfully, in stepped this gentleman, James M. Coleman, Scottish-born mill engineer, very, very sharp businessman. He guaranteed to pledge as much as $60,000 if his neighbors would at least make an attempt to join with him. He wanted to build a line from Seattle down the Duwamish Valley, where it would hook up with a new railroad coming from Renton, where a coal mine had just opened recently, 1874, the Renton coal mine opened. Coleman reasoned that, well, this new railroad might never reach Walla Walla, but if it could reach the coal mine at Renton, and maybe even the one at Newcastle, it would pay for itself. Several hundred white and Chinese laborers pitched in. A 2-mile-long trestle was built across Elliott Bay to a new coal bunker at the foot of King Street in 1876 and 1877. Seattle-Renton line, the first stretch of the Seattle and Walla Walla, opened in early 1877, followed a year later by the extension to Newcastle, setting off a new era of growth and prosperity. Proud symbol of this new order was Seattle and Walla Walla engine number 1, fittingly named A.A. Denny. These are very rare pictures. The rarest of them all is an actual Seattle and Walla Walla passenger train, actually converted flat cars used as a train to the Meadows racetrack where Boeing Field is now. All these cars were built in Seattle, including the running gear, the metal castings. This was a huge feat for the time, and it made everybody proud. Even then, Seattle was getting a swollen head. And well, she should. For just as Lucius Garfield had predicted, Seattle's pluck and hard work caught the attention of big money. In the fall of 1880, the reigning wizard of Wall Street, Henry Villard, purchased the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad and the Newcastle coal mine. His corporate entity, the Oregon Improvement Company, took over things. Everybody was ecstatic. Seattle's ship had come in. The Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad was renamed the Columbia and Puget Sound. Grand aspirations. Over the next 5 years, the Oregon Improvement Company built Seattle, which she had long dreamed of, its standard gauge railroad to the outside world. This was the Puget Sound Shore Railroad Company, to run between Seattle and a point south of present-day Auburn, where it would meet the Northern Pacific, which was building east from Tacoma, heading for the mountains over Stampede or some other as yet to be determined pass. The Villard boom was heady times for Seattle and King County.
Wow.
During the 1880s, Seattle's population tripled. Well, it all came to a shuddering halt during the National Depression known as the Panic of 1893. The Oregon Improvement Company, which had been financially wobbly much of its time, went bankrupt, and labor unrest became the order of the day. Still, coal remained in strong demand, and business slowly recovered during the 1890s. In late 1897, the Oregon Improvement Company was reorganized as part of the new Pacific Coast Company. The Columbia and Puget Sound Railroad was converted to standard gauge. Here you see the bright, shiny new engines just delivered. Standard gauge, 4 foot 8.5. And in the back, already fading into history, the A.A. Denny and her sisters, which were a 3 foot narrow gauge. Narrow gauge was another Lucius Garfield suggestion. Could be built much more cheaply and quickly than standard gauge. But standard gauge railroads can haul more and really more economically over time. Well, by the late 1890s, Seattle was really outgrowing her old clothes. Here you see the railroad facilities, the Columbia and Puget Sound line curving along the foot of Beacon Hill to the King Street bunkers. And this is the new standard gauge line that Henry Villard provided, known as the broad gauge strip. This was basically an outdoor staging area, warehousing, passenger station here. Pretty chaotic. Not much room to grow, really. So all the railroads got together with the city, and they hammered out a new and better way. Completed in 1906, King Street Station 1911 Oregon-Washington station. Make out the old alignment of the broad gauge strip. Columbia Puget Sound got a new terminus at the foot of Dearborn Street with new electric coal bunkers and a new engine house. Here's a map of the area before and the new route into Seattle. The old. Very important deal between the Little Seattle Railroad was made with the giant Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound in 1906. The Milwaukee was building west from South Dakota, and they needed a way to get into Puget Sound from their crossing over Snoqualmie Pass. So they made a 99-year lease with the Columbia and Puget Sound to use the Seattle Railroad's right-of-way between Maple Valley and Seattle. It's a good deal. Milwaukee insisted on new, heavier 85-pound rail. They wanted double tracking between South Seattle and into the city, and block signal systems. Big-time stuff. Here's a little Pacific Coast train heading east in South Seattle, a line of empty coal cars going back to Black Diamond. Well, during the World War I era, coal really hit its peak. Local mines were at their busiest. After that, however, coal began a steady decline. It was being overshadowed by higher quality coal from east of the Cascades and the Rocky Mountains, as well as, of course, fuel oil and electricity. Branch lines of the Columbia and Puget Sound Railroad were lopped off one by one, culminating in the 1931 closure of the Newcastle branch. By 1948, trains to Black Diamond were down to about once or twice a week, and the future of Seattle's little railroad looked bleak. The Pacific Coast Railroad, which was the old Columbia and Puget Sound, renamed in 1916 as part of the Pacific Coast Coal Company, went looking for buyers. They didn't really want to abandon the line. They thought they could find, if they could find a big railroad to buy it, it would have a good future left. A logical buyer would have been the Milwaukee Railroad, but the Milwaukee sort of hemmed and hawed, thinking there'd be no competing buyers. They sort of wanted to dicker around with the asking price of $2 million. Well, in stepped Great Northern. They had a local vice president that saw great potential in the Pacific Coast, especially because it had prime industrial land in Renton. The Boeing Company, Pacific Car and Foundry, and other industries all on the main line of the Pacific Coast Railroad. Great Northern paid $1,700,000 and never regretted it. They replaced the rickety old Pacific Coast rolling stock, and they immediately instituted a crash program to strengthen bridges and make other improvements so they could replace the antiquated steam engines with diesel power. They built nice new depots at Renton and Maple Valley. Here's a typical coal train coming down the main street of Renton from Black Diamond in the 1950s. And another Pacific Coast train switching in Renton. By the 1960s, this run had become known to crews as the Renton Rocket. It was a 15-hour, 59-minute job that not many people really wanted, but it was a valuable asset to the Great Northern, and it steadily made money. The annual reports for the Pacific Coast Railroad are all available at the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive, and they show a reasonably respectable bottom line through all these years. And to this day, the descendant of the Pacific Coast Railroad, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, remains a short but vital part of the regional transportation system. So let's take a ride on the Pacific Coast in its heyday, which we can do thanks to the photographic pioneering artistry of James A. Turner and his good friend Harold Hill. There's James Turner on the Pacific Coast engine number 14 in Seattle. James Turner was a streetcar conductor who on his days off would pack up his heavy photographic gear and hop a freight train or a passenger train and go out into the hinterlands and take train pictures. So we'll start in Seattle at the Seattle Engine House, and New Year's Eve Day, New Year's Eve Day, 1947, Tom Wilschnig, whom I interviewed for this book, signing in to spend the day switching in the yards in Seattle. And here is senior engineer Fritz Soderbeck logging on for another trip to Black Diamond. Here's Tom bringing out old number, 12, to switch in the yards. And here's the Seattle yard overall, Pacific Coast yard here with empty coal cars ready to head back to Black Diamond. Here's their yard office here. The Pacific Coast did run passenger trains. This is the timetable from 1907. Pretty busy. Newcastle branch, Maple Valley branch up to Taylor, and the main line to Black Diamond and Franklin. A lot of service. Here's a typical passenger train in Seattle at the little depot at the foot of Washington Street. And there were 4 Pacific Coast piers, piers A through D. Big time operation, well into the 20th century. Here's another passenger train waiting to depart Washington Street Depot probably for Black Diamond. And here's a freight train coming out of Seattle, heading for Black Diamond, long string of empty coal cars. Conductor here is Joe Bow, who's a long-time stalwart on the Pacific Coast. One of the hallmarks of the antique little Pacific Coast Railroad was its striking contrast with the electric-powered streamliners of the Milwaukee, racing eastward south of Seattle. Here's another little Pacific Coast freight passing under the old Allentown covered bridge. Anybody remember the covered bridge? Burned in 1959, supposedly after kids were playing with matches. And this fellow would have been hauling company materials and maybe some taking empty box cars to service some of the industries in Renton. Over here is the Union Pacific line, and over here in the background is the double-track Northern Pacific Great Northern. All the railroads coming into Seattle from the south met at Black River Junction, about 10 miles south of town. This interlocking tower was built by Union Pacific. They were the last one to Seattle, so they had to pay for this. to control the movements through the junction. He's just making his turn now to the east to head toward Renton and up to Maple Valley. Passing the old Renton Depot now. Brakemen on the front of the engine ready to hop off and make their switching cuts back into the little yard here where they would pick up and leave cars destined for Renton Industries and maybe for interchange with other railroads. Here's our old friend Fritz Soderback again, watching him meet with the westbound Milwaukee freight train about 1940. So from Renton, the Newcastle branch ran 6 miles, tough bit of railroad, built in 1877-78. Steep grades, sharp curves, a lot of unstable ground, wet, prone to landslides. It was a tough piece of railroad to build and operate, but it made a big difference in the development of the area. Just north of Renton, the Pacific Coast Company established a station they called Briquetteville to serve a new charcoal briquette plant. Established, I think, around 1915, and for a number of years it provided a pretty successful product, especially favored by orchardists that used the charcoal briquettes in smudge pots to keep their trees warm. It went out of business during the Depression, however. There was also a log dump nearby at the little station of Lakeside, North Renton, where logs came over the Pacific coast and were dumped into Lake Washington and then rafted up to the big lumber mills in Ballard. Well, the landmark on the Newcastle branch was the May Creek Trestle. The original trestle was curved here, and but in 1910 it was replaced by this straight structure, both of which were said to be the largest timber trestles west of St. Louis. You can just see guys here. There's a man standing there. There's another one there. And at Newcastle, this is the early Newcastle mine. You see an empty coal car going back down to the mine. Up here is the sorting shed for sorting out the various grades of coal, which were then loaded into railroad cars here and taken out this way. During the 1880s, another mine was opened 2 miles east at Coal Creek. And this Coal Creek mine somewhat supplanted the Newcastle mine for a number of years. In 1929, however, it suffered a severe fire, and that pretty much ended operations both at Coal Creek and Newcastle. Here's a favorite picture. Little number 7, the Hayek, and its proud crew. Brakeman with his brake club, which would be used to crank the handbrakes on the cars. How'd you like to do that on a winter night? 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours. In about 1880, locomotive engineers might make $3 a day. Brakemen, $1.50 a day. Hard work, difficult conditions, primitive equipment, dangerous, very dangerous always. But the faces of these men show pride and a realization that they're building their community. Back in Renton, less than 100 years later, we see this eastbound train of empty coal cars heading back to Black Diamond. brakeman Pete Lopez on the front, whose job now is to shoo cars out of the way. And in the 1940s, another eastbound train heading through Cedar Mountain. There's our brakeman on the front again, spotting for rocks on the track and also ready to do more switching. First Maple Valley Depot, built by the Columbia and Puget Sound Railroad. I think there's a Shell station about where this is now. And looking south, there's the depot here, up toward the trestle over the Cedar River. Second Maple Valley Depot was built in 1911. Here's an eastbound train passing, getting his running orders from operator Hugh O'Neill. Now, coal was not Pacific Coast's only commodity. In the 1890s, there was a new coal mine opened in the hills east of Maple Valley, but they also mined clay. This was another venture of Seattle founder Arthur Denny. So they established a station there called Taylor, and they built this 9-mile Maple Valley branch to service this new facility, which became one of the nation's leading manufacturers of porcelain and terracotta building materials and vitrified conduit. Very busy, very important source of new traffic for the Pacific Coast Railroad. So we'll follow a Pacific Coast train from Maple Valley. In its last days, the site of that mill was, the city of Seattle became afraid that the pollution from that mill would damage their groundwater because it was tributary to the Cedar River watershed. So the city of Seattle began pressuring the mill and surrounding property owners to vacate and condemn the whole area to protect the Seattle water supply. Here we are leaving Maple Valley, heading up the steep grade into the hills east of town. All these photos were taken by Harold Hill, passing the Peacock home. Same place today. Here's the old right-of-way here, owned by the same family. And arriving in Taylor. There wasn't much in Taylor, but the mill, the mine, and the big mill we saw, and a few houses. Now they're discussing where to put the cars. Backing down from Taylor here is a log train, perhaps one of the last of its kind to run on the line. During the early 1900s, logging became another primary industry on the Maple Valley branch and another alternative source of traffic for the Pacific Coast Railroad. These huge logs were being taken down to that dump on Lake Washington for rafting up to Ballard. And from Maple Valley, you have also the 7.5-mile branch line down to Black Diamond, which was built in the 1885-86 by the Oregon Improvement Company and extended to Franklin. Trains always had to take water before they began the climb up the 1.38% grade to Lake Wilderness in Maple Valley. Here's our old friend Fritz Soderback again, senior engineer. The other engineers didn't really like him very much. He was not considered very competent and difficult to work with, but being senior, job security, he lasted till late days. They filled the water tank from the Cedar River, and every now and then they'd see trout swimming around in the tender, much to the delight of the resident anglers on the crew. Here he is coming up grade now, near Lake Wilderness. And there's conductor Joe Bow waving from the caboose. At Henry's, he crossed over the Northern Pacific Main Line. There was a little small sawmill here that provided occasional traffic for the Pacific Coast, as well as a notorious house of ill repute. Now here's a giant mine number 11 at Black Diamond. Now I know I'm in the hot seat here because I'm sure there are experts who know much more about this than I do, but this is said to be the deepest mine of its kind in the country. I think a 6,000 foot total depth, and it lasted, I understand, until almost 1950. Palmer Coking Coal Company continues sand and gravel operations here to this day, and they're doing very well with it. And here we are, taken probably around 1920. Here's that little two-car train we saw sitting in Seattle, just arrived at Black Diamond. And 3 miles further on, the end of the line at Franklin, which was established in the 1890s, did very well for a number of years, but they had a series of fires and explosions, and by 1922, Franklin was pretty well shut down. Here's the passenger train just about to leave Franklin. Workers' houses on the hill here, and the general store and depot here. Well, the Seattle and Walla Walla, Columbia and Puget Sound, and Pacific Coast railroads were small, cash-poor, seemingly insignificant little operations, but they were a significant product of homegrown enterprise, demonstrating what frontier economies, strong personalities, and luck were capable of achieving. They were an enterprise that Seattle and King County could truly call their own. And they made possible the urban society that 150 years later has lost none of its vitality and magnetism